when, of course, George H.W. Bush was in office. Your father, the work he did with the DNC, opposing a lot of those various things. One of the things that happens when a president dies, whether they're Republican or Democrat, you have laudatory views of people. Also, in the case of George H.W. Bush, he was 94 years old. But you also, as they say, there's one story, then there's the whole story. Your perspective in terms of how we should remember his presidency overall, but specifically when it comes to African Americans.
Well, first of all, to his family and to his public service, certainly thoughts and prayers. But I remember a time, and it's a difficult situation because clearly you want to mourn the passing of the former president. But we also have to remember some other things that occurred. And as a young advanced man for Michael Dukakis, when he was running for president, there was a close, the polls were very close at the time. And then there was that racist ad that popped up with Willie Horton. And whether it was the party, whether it was Roger Ailes, whoever did it,
Lee Atwater, of course, who was the campaign manager.
You got to assume the candidate approved of that ad. And when you approve of that ad, yes, I heard the other nice things he clearly may or may not have done during his presidency. But to become president, he ran an extremely racist ad that turned the race around, and clearly he became president and beat Michael Dukakis.
Eugene.
I was born during the middle of Bush's term, so everything I know about him is either via history, via read, or what's been interpreted now. But if I can make a contrast of the president that Bush 41 was and the president we have today, man, we've come a long way. I mean, man, we've come a very long way. Responsible for the American Disabilities Act, key player in the Fair Housing Act, going against the wishes of some of his big dollar donors and whatnot. But if I could say, if we, looking at 2020, could look for a model of what a president should be, even, with disagreements, handling, an opposition party in Congress. I would much rather live through a President, Bush 41 than the current Trump times we have right now.
Avis Armstrong talked about, obviously, the appointment of Clarence Thomas. That was a huge issue there. Many people accused President George Bush of, on one hand, saying he didn't believe in quotas, but then appointing Clarence Thomas there based upon the quotas. He'd only been on the appeals court for 15 months. This was his first time ever as a judge. And many said he simply did not have the stature to replace a legend like Thurgood Marshall. So your perspective on the presidency of George Bush, specifically as it relates to black folks.
Absolutely. Now, with that case in particular, I remember Thurgood Marshall. I'm a little bit older than you, Eugene. I remember Thurgood Marshall's final press conference when he was about to step down from the court. And he said something during that press conference that was actually very prophetic. He said that in terms of whether or not the person who replaced him, if that person should be white or black, he specifically said you can have a black snake just as easily as you can have a white snake. And unfortunately, it's my belief that with the Clarence Thomas selection, it was a black snake that was elected, that was appointed to replace the amazing icon that was a Thurgood Marshall. So unfortunately, that's a very disappointing legacy for me in terms of George Bush.
When we also look at, Michael, you talked about the Willie Horton ad. That was a huge issue. And of course, his campaign manager was Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater, after Bush won, Bush made him head of the Republican National Committee. Then with tapes were later discovered where he talked about in terms of how you use race in campaigns. You could no longer say the N-word. You couldn't say things along those lines, but you could use other phrases that were speaking in essence in code. You said, look, candidate had to be aware of that. And that's also the reality. That's also a part of the legacy of George H.W. Bush. Also, I think when we look at in terms of policies, he was following 8 years of Ronald Reagan. Again, I think certainly a different type of Republican that was clearly different than what you see today. Some will say he was not as hardcore as a Ronald Reagan that led a little bit differently than Reagan.
Absolutely. And to Secretary Sullivan's points, and I just found it interesting. And again, it's hard to criticize when we're also mourning our former president. However, I found it interesting, as the secretary mentioned, he had to call to get permission to hire black folks. I mean, why don't you just hire the best people? And the best people happen to be people of color. Great. The fact that he had to make a phone call, do you mind if I hire some black folks? What's that? What is that? So clearly there was an environment where he thought, well, I can't hire some black folks. I better call and get some permission first. That is also part of the legacy.
See, for me, I don't see it as, and I think that this is part of the problem. I don't see it as criticizing. No, the bottom line is, if you're talking about a person's legacy, then there is the good, the bad, and the ugly. There are things that other people will say, well, you really shouldn't bring those things up. There should not be a whitewashing of somebody's history, because the reality is it happened. He did appoint Clarence Thomas. That was a contentious issue that we still deal with today when it comes to Supreme Court hearings. In terms of how we run campaign ads, that actually existed as well. Also, Eugene, in terms of how the people of Haiti were treated under President George H.W. Bush. I mean, all of these things are part of a president's legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Lee Atwater doesn't become head of the RNC by magic. I mean, president, sitting president has full reign and pick of who he wants to lead the party and who wants to chair the party, and more importantly, especially when that former president was once a chair of the party themselves. But the legacy of Bush 41 is probably going to be, although he was a one-term president, probably going to be more fuller than most of our political leaders that we've had. I mean, someone that served in the House of Representatives, served as our, head of the CIA, served as head of the RNC, the vice president and president. I think probably I'll say this, I think one of the issues that people kind of brush up against with his legacy is that he's been a major shaper of our international policy from the roles that he's played rather than our domestic policy, which people can feel and, affect, it's something that you feel is tangible. The Berlin Wall comes down, that's something that's, whoo, rah, rah, but, it doesn't necessarily something that Americans can feel.
You also have, of course, the case of Keith Jackson, the young man who was lured to the White House to sell crack, and it took a whole lot to make that happen. President Bush wanted to be able to state in his speech that you can buy crack outside of the White House, when reality is nobody was selling crack outside the White House. Look at the news reports when that young man was being interviewed, Keith Jackson. Even though he lived here, he didn't even know where the White House was located. And then he finally said, "Oh, you mean the place where Reagan lives?" And it was a whole lot that took place just to get him to come to sell these drugs to an undercover cop. Then he gets hit with a significant prison sentence. That legacy is also a part of that of George H.W. Bush, because they went through all of that so he could be able to hold up a bag of crack to say this was purchased outside. And so people talk about Bill Clinton and mass incarceration, but if you look, Bill Clinton came after George H.W. Bush. There were significant sentences that were being handed down in federal courts when it came to drugs, because we dealt with crack in the early 80s. Bush was president again for 88 to 92.
Yep.
And that man lost 10 years of his life because of being ensnarled. Exactly, in terms of his time, in terms of being snarled in that entrapment campaign, basically, just for political purposes. So it's definitely not a bright spot on that presidency. But I will say also, in terms of the broader context, you mentioned if we compare him to our current president, Lord, anything looks better than that. But I would also say, just looking in terms of our drug policy, if you compare, where we were then with the war on drugs, and particularly with the just overly verbose incarceration efforts around crack cocaine, as compared with all of a sudden seeing our current sort of crisis around drugs being a health problem and it's primarily impacted the white community, it's a completely night and day reaction.
Yeah, so I mean, I would just hope that, first of all, it's interesting. I wonder when it comes to all these other networks, how many black folks have they been calling? Because there were African Americans who did serve. And granted, Secretary Sullivan was the only African American cabinet member. We also reached out to Fred McClure. Fred McClure He was the first black student body president at Texas A&M University, served as special assistant to President George H.W. Bush. He's been involved in the planning of the state funeral, and so hopefully we'll get him on tomorrow or Wednesday. But also Judy Smith, who, of course, folks know from Scandal.
Yeah.
She served in the Bush administration as well, and so we also look to talk to Michael Williams, who served in the Bush administration, also another African-American from Texas who served in housing and urban development. So hopefully we'll be talking to those folks over the next 2 days. You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com.